I run a cybersecurity consultancy. I've been doing consulting and I've been leading consulting teams in cybersecurity for about almost 25 years now. Um, I've run teams of really deeply technical folks like penetration testers, code auditors, and so on, as well as teams that do higher level kinds of services like governance, risk management, compliance kind of consulting, doing IT audit, those kinds of things. These days, in my consulting roles, I tend to specialize in more strategic level security consulting. So really consulting at the security program level, providing services like being a virtual chief information security officers, typically for smaller and middle-sized companies who maybe aren't quite in a position to hire a full-time person to be responsible for their entire security operations yet. And so I sort of fill that role for them on a fractional kind of basis. Mark Jaster from 418 Intelligence, he really reached out and got involved with a number of other state community college systems and got connected with Edmonds College here in Washington State, and also with the Louisiana Delta Community College system. And so we actually did our first cohort with Edmonds was a joint cohort where we had students from Louisiana and from Edmonds as part of that cohort. And so that was interesting. We kind of split the difference time zone wise to help it make it a little more convenient for everyone involved. And so that seemed to be pretty successful. And at this point, we've now completed 2 cohorts of students from Edmonds. Just finished one up that it started right after Thanksgiving, and then we just ended probably about 3 or 4 weeks ago, something like that. So it's been great getting. Edmonds has been a really good partner in terms of giving us a good pipeline of candidates and of students to fill our cohorts with. I really enjoy helping people break into the cybersecurity field. I like helping them get that foundational set of skills that's really required. Because I come I came into this industry from a pretty non-traditional background myself. I attended the University of Washington, really had intended to go into, eventually like practicing medicine. And while in general, I love math, I love the hard sciences and so on, I have to admit that organic chemistry, and particularly the hours of lab work in a lab coat wearing goggles, was not my favorite. And so, I started shopping for majors at university, and I landed on at least what at that time was a program called Society and Justice. I had intended to go into federal law enforcement, FBI, Secret Service, something like that. But again, serendipity sort of reared its head, and my parents' neighbor at the time was with the Seattle Police Department and was an academy instructor. And he encouraged me to just go apply to the SPD to see, what it was like to go through the application process for a law enforcement agency. So I did, and got offered a slot, and it became sort of a bird in the hand, two in the bush kind of situation. So I joined the Seattle Police Department. I was with SPD for about 11 years, all through the 90s. I was a detective for a lot of that time. And I was one of a handful of detectives at SPD in the mid-90s who went to computer forensics training. And this was really early on in the life cycle of that discipline. It was long before there were specialized tools like Expert Witness or Encase or FTK and some of the other tools that are common today. Back then, we either had to use standard data recovery tools or we had to write our own tools. And so, I got to writing low-level software and so on back in MS-DOS days and early Windows 3.1. And then I got recruited away from law enforcement by one of the big 4, or at that time it was big 5 accounting firms. I was a manager in their information risk management practice. I ran a team of consultants to do vulnerability assessments and some general security consulting. And of course, we also had to, support the technical side of financial audit, because that was the bread and butter of these accounting firms. And then eventually I just kept moving on to more and more technical consultancies, running teams there, ran really specialized teams of penetration testers, code reviewers, security researchers, and so on. Um, and then, about 5 or 6 years ago now, probably 6 years ago now, I started my own consultancy. So that's kind of the trajectory. Really, I started getting into the training aspect of things even when I was still running penetration testing teams, because it seemed to me to be a logical like a logical extension of doing assessment and vulnerability testing and pen testing, because we would go and test software for vulnerabilities, and we'd give a report. We'd explain the findings to those developers, and they'd go and they'd fix those issues. But then we'd come back the next year, and there'd be the same types of issues. They were just in different places in the software, right? And so it became pretty clear to me that, look, yeah, we're happy to keep coming back every year, and we're willing to, we'll bill you for every time we test, but wouldn't it be better if you guys would stop writing vulnerable software, right? And within the program, I try to hit a pretty broad swath of the topic areas within the field of cybersecurity, because there's a lot of stuff that you need to know, right? Some of these areas are much more high level in nature, so less deeply technical, less geeky, if you will. So there are things like compliance, governance, risk management. How as an organization you align your operations with recognized security frameworks and standards, things like that. But then we definitely get down into the weeds in terms of low-level operating system aspects that are exploited by attackers, those kinds of things, networking and so on. I really want them to understand how the technology actually works, and then be able to extrapolate from these fundamental foundational concepts to whatever future technologies are lurking just around the corner, right? Because if you just memorize things for today, well, that's not necessarily going to apply next week. So you really need to understand the how and the why behind things, Let's see. So we dive also into web application security, looking at how the technical underpinnings of web application attacks. We look at real world malware. We don't have time, again, to really turn people into reverse engineers per se, but we do teach them the skills to be able to do some basic static analysis of unknown binaries, to be able to instrument virtual machines so that they can safely detonate malware and observe its behavior. And most importantly, again, I want them to understand the process of what they're doing, so that they can do things like they can knowledgeably speak about it during a job interview, right? Be able to talk about the process of malware analysis and what it is. We spend a lot of time talking about cryptography. And again, I want to make sure that they really understand the underlying principles of encryption schemes and what makes things like digital signatures and certificates actually secure and reliable. It's important that they understand how encryption technology is applied to particular situations, and maybe sometimes it's not always the right fit. And again, being able to speak to it and describe the encryption technology, things like that are important, like TLS, for example, in a job interview, is really going to set them apart from other applicants for that job. And I think that in this program, one of the particularly unique aspects of the 418 TradeCraft program is the use of a proprietary platform that provides the students with a curated interaction with and investigation of real world threats in a near real time basis, right? So we assign students potentially malicious URLs and potentially malicious real binaries that are pulled from real world threat intelligence sources. So this could be actual malware. This could be an actual phishing site that's trying to spread malware and so on. And so the students have to then perform investigative and analytical procedures on the particular thing that we've given them. They need to document their analysis steps. They then need to actually put their cards down and make a decision, make a conclusion as to whether the thing is malicious or not, and to what degree of confidence they're saying that it is or is not malicious. And then we have their work checked and validated by coaches, all of whom are working cybersecurity professionals. And they give feedback to the students as to the analysis they performed, and other things that they maybe could have considered to make their analysis more accurate, those kinds of things. And then towards the end of the program, we also spend a fair amount of time doing practice interview questions as a group. So I present a range of technical and non-technical questions that are likely to come up during a cybersecurity job interview. And then everyone has a chance to learn from everybody else's performance during those sessions, right? So security, it's a growing field for sure, right? Depending, there's lots of statistics out there, and kind of depending on which studies you want to believe, there's something around roughly 3 to 3.5 million unfilled cybersecurity jobs worldwide right now, and somewhere between like 600,000 and 750,000 of those are in the U.S. And that number is, it doesn't seem to be shrinking. It seems to be great. This job is well suited for precocious 4-year-olds. And right. So what I mean by that is that kids of that age, they keep asking why until they get to some level of understanding of a topic that satisfies them, right? So, and that this kind of gets back to my philosophy of wanting to make sure that people understand, or students understand, how the technology actually works. I feel like we've abstracted a lot of the complexity of the underlying components in computers and through the user interface with computers over the last 30, 40 years or something. And that's great, because it means that the computers now are generally really easy to use, right? Anybody can kind of use them, and they're generalized tools. But it's also, in a way, a little bit bad, because, well, nearly anybody can kind of use a computer to some degree. What that means is that the more people who are using computers, that means that a smaller and smaller percentage of the users actually know how they work and actually know how to protect them, right? And so I tend to use the analogy of car ownership, where so I first started using a computer in about 1978, maybe. And back then, having a personal computer, I think, was probably something like owning a car in 1920, right? Where you really needed to know how the darn thing worked, and you needed to know how to fix it, because sooner or later something was going to go wrong, right? And you had to fix it. Whereas today, you can go down and buy a Tesla, and you can drive it just fine. You can drive it easily, but good luck working on it by yourself, right? Or even explaining to somebody, how the control modules work and how they talk to other parts of the car or whatever. And so I think, we've gotten to that place with computers in general, where they're just, in a way, really easy to use. And so, and if you don't really understand the technical underpinnings of them, you're at a disadvantage, right? So I guess what I'm getting at there is that cybersecurity is a really great fit for people who always want to peel back the next layer of the onion, always want to look behind the next curtain and understand what's really going on, how things really work, and why they were designed in a particular way. Because it's that level of understanding that your adversaries are operating from, because they get down into the weeds, into those very low-level granular details, because that's how they discover new vulnerabilities, and that's how they design new attack methods. I guess maybe another point worth mentioning is that you to do well to have longevity in this field. It's worth mentioning that you should be comfortable sitting in front of a computer for long periods of time. And I know that sounds like obvious, but the reality is that it sometimes escapes people until they're actually doing the job, right? And I bring this up. I actually had a student who was just stellar at picking up the material, really took to learning how to code and so on. He got a job out the gate as a cyber analyst at a pretty big company. He was doing really well, got promoted very quickly. He was only about 2 years into it, though, something like that. And then I had heard that he quit. So I reached out to him. I said, hey, what's going on? He goes, I just figured out that I really prefer to work outdoors. And so, I'm just kind of offering that as a, hey, maybe you should think about that just before, because it's the sort of thing that might sneak up on you, like it snuck up on this guy, right? I guess I'd also mention that it's a super fast-paced field. So threats, vulnerabilities, attacks, technologies, they all change constantly, right? And what was best practice defensively, like as a strategy last week, could be considered to be old and broken by next week.